Hello and welcome to this spooky edition of Reading Outside of My Comfort Zone. If you're new to my channel or new to this series, hi, my name is Hannah. I love stories. I read a lot of books, and this year it has been one of my goals to read outside of my comfort zone. And today we're doing a spooky version, a spooky Halloween edition of Reading Outside of My Comfort Zone, in which I read 3 horror books. The 3 horror books I will be reading in this vlog are The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas, The Hollow Places by T. King Fisher, and The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Without further ado, let's get into the reading vlog. To kick off this reading vlog, I am reading the recommendation of none other than Katie Marie Reads. A couple months ago, she did a little reading vlog in which she read Mexican Gothic, which was my introduction into horror last year, and the reason that I'm doing this. Katie read Mexican Gothic, loved it. I commented on that video and I was like, hey Katie, I also loved Mexican Gothic and you've read more horror than me. Is there anything you've read that's similar, that has the creepy house, the scary dreams, spooky ghosty stuff? She recommended The Hacienda. So that's what I'm reading now. The little description here says Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca. I feel like that is the perfect description of this book. If I were to summarize the feel of this book, our main character's name is Beatriz, and she has just gotten married to the owner of this hacienda. The owner of this hacienda, his first wife, mysteriously, suddenly died like a year or two ago. And now here she is, the new wife, coming to his grand estate, and things are spooky. Okay, going off of that description, I like this better than Rebecca, because Rebecca, I read it last year after reading Mexican Gothic because it's one of the classic Gothic. I'm not sure if it's horror or if it's just like Gothic without the horror. I read it and it was fine, but more psychological. Rebecca, there's no ghosts, there's no spooky things happening. I really wanted there to be a little bit of a, ooh, is there a ghost? Is that in my head or was that a ghost? But there wasn't anything like that. Was a little disappointed by that. I wish there had been that in Rebecca. This has that. Her husband has to go back to the capital on business or something like that. She's settling in and spooky things start happening. For example, she goes to open a trunk of clothes and all the clothes are soaked in blood and she's what? And then she comes back several minutes later and there's nothing there. There's little things like that have been happening, right? And that started happening pretty early on. I'm really liking this. I like it more than Rebecca, but not as much as Mexican Gothic yet. So I have 100 pages left. I'm gonna finish it and then I'll let you know what I think. I'm going to tell you about The Hacienda because I have finished it and I have thoughts. So this book is compared to both Mexican Gothic and Rebecca. Here's what I loved about Mexican Gothic. It was creepy and I could feel it in my bones. Like my whole being was just creeped out and I loved feeling just that deep creep. I did not feel so strongly with this one. I feel like part of it was just like, yes, this had ghosts and I appreciate that there were ghosts. I feel like the scary things, they were scary. They were still kind of like, ooh, but it wasn't like, I don't know, it wasn't the same as Mexican Gothic, I think. And I think part of it was just that it was like too obvious, like blood dripping down the walls and things, and like the wall falling apart to reveal a skeleton and like stuff like that was happening in here, and that was just like too, it was a very classically haunted house. Whereas like Mexican Gothic was like a haunted house, but it wasn't like blood dripping down the walls. This has ghosts, this has blood dripping down walls. This also has a similar setting. It is set in Mexico, in the countryside of Mexico. Different time period though, like I said, set in the 1820s. Did I say that? No, this is set in the 1820s, so a little bit of a different time period. I believe Mexican Gothic is supposed to take place in the 1950s, 1960s, so different time period, but similar Mexican countryside setting, big house, creepy house, haunted, scary things happening in the house. So this was good. A good start to the horror vlog. Yesterday I started reading Hollow Places by T. King Fisher. This again is another recommendation from Katie Marie. In a recent video she made all about horror books, she said that this is the scariest book that she's read. And yes, I want to be scared. I want that deeply unsettling feeling that I had when I read Mexican Gothic. So I'm hoping that this will give me that same, like just like in my bones. I want to feel it in my bones. This was great, but I didn't feel it in my bones. Yes, it had everything I wanted Rebecca. I wish Rebecca had. It didn't shake me to my core like Mexican Gothic did. So I'm hoping this does that. I finished The Hollow Places. Now, I had planned to make like a little halfway point update for you. That did not go according to plan, and I have no excuse. I really don't have a good excuse. Last week when I was reading The Hacienda, I didn't give you a halfway reading update because I'd gotten my hair done. It didn't look the way I wanted it to. I was feeling self-conscious. I had a reason for not filming. Is it a silly reason? Sure. But like, there was a reason. This time, I got to the halfway point. It was late at night. I was like, you know what? I'm really tired. I'm just gonna go to sleep. This feels like a good place to close the book. Nothing scary is happening at the moment. I'm gonna close the book. I'm gonna go to sleep. I did that. I went to sleep. The next day, I was gonna film my update, but then I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna read, and then I ended up finishing the book that day. So here's what I would have said in the halfway update for The Hollow Places. This book, the only thing I knew about it when I picked it up was Katie Marie said it's scary, and that the main character is a woman named Kara in her 30s who is recently divorced. That's all I knew about this book when I picked it up. So when I start reading, and in the first chapter, Kara moves in with her uncle who owns this weird old museum with a bunch of weird stuff in it. I was like, oh, I know how this is gonna go. Nope. It did not go the way I thought it would go. And if you want to read The Hollow Places, if you're interested in reading The Hollow Places, I do want you to know it is terrifying. It is scary. I was reading kind of like that. And so if you want that experience, please go pick up the book and do not read the back of the book. I feel like it's best to be surprised like I was. If you read it, if you don't plan to read it, if you don't mind being a little bit spoiled, not only by me, but also the back of the book, then let me tell you that the direction this goes is that a doorway opens up in this museum that leads Kara into another world that is terrifying. In the book, it kind of compares this experience to Narnia. It's Narnia, but terrifying. And like I said, there's some truly just gross, creepy, gory things. Yeah, just like gross kind of creepy, you know? Insides being on the outside of people's bodies, that kind of thing. The fact that Kara and her friend get lost in this other world and don't know how to get back to the real world is also terrifying. And there's like a lot of suspense in that. Here are my final thoughts. It was terrifying. It was scary. I was reading it kind of like this with my teeth clenched and like funny faces, and my husband kept looking over at me and being like, must be scary. You look pretty scared. And yes, it was scary, and I was scared. However, it still does not quite live up to nor replace Mexican Gothic as my favorite horror. Or I had this feeling through the first 75 to 80% of Mexican Gothic, like, oh, this seems kind of real, you know? And like I said, in the ending, it does get kind of like, yeah, this is definitely not real. You know, if you've read it, you know. But I think because the first 80% felt like it was possible, it was scarier. Whereas like this one, it's taking place in a whole entire different world, and that happens pretty quickly, you know? And like, yes, I was surprised by that, but like, and like I did end up being really scared by that. But when they initially find this other world, I was kind of not disappointed, just I didn't think I would be that scared by it. And again, like I did end up being terrified by some of the things that were happening in this world. What I'm trying to say is the scariest part of Mexican Gothic is that a lot of it felt possible. Like it could happen in this reality, right? Didn't have that factor. It was still terrifying, but it didn't have that same reality factor. So there you go. I've been talking about this for 10 minutes, and now it's time to tell you that I've started reading The Haunting of Hill House. This will be the last book of this little reading vlog, and I figured why not go out with a bang. This is a classic in the horror genre, so I'm gonna go ahead and read it. I'm on chapter 2, so I'm like barely into it. A couple of initial thoughts. Number one, this is the Penguin Classics edition, and there's a little introduction in this about kind of explaining why it is a classic in the horror genre, and I found that really interesting. In the first chapter, we see Eleanor. She gets invited to Hill House by this researcher who's researching paranormal activity, blah, blah, blah. And as she's driving away, like she's imagining all of these things, like she's driving along the road, and we see all of these like little daydream scenarios that she's thinking of in her head as she's driving to Hill House. And I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting. An interesting way to start the book, just showing us like how imaginative she is. And I feel like I'm interested to see what happens later on in the book. I do wonder and I'm kind of getting the feeling that like maybe that was kind of to make her kind of an unreliable narrator. Is this house actually haunted, or is this just a big daydream that she's dreaming up in her head? We'll see what happens. I'm halfway through The Haunting of Hill House. Here are my thoughts. I'm liking it. So far we've only had one truly spooky, unexplainable thing happen. I kind of like the dynamic so far. Like just the contrast between Eleanor, Theodora. The contrast between the two of them is really interesting to me because like you can tell they're both scared. You can tell that they're both kind of unsure of what they're doing here, what their purpose is at this house. And they're both, I don't know, I just get the sense that they're both kind of, unsure of why they're even here and like what they should be doing. And Eleanor, I feel like her anxiety is a little bit more apparent than Theodora's. Theodora is like trying to play it super cool, super chill. She's the cool girl, nothing gets to her. And so it's just interesting to see how they're both kind of handling this. And I also think, like I said, only one truly like spooky, ghosty thing has happened so far in this book. The first half of the book, I feel like really lays the groundwork really well for the spookiness. We're told kind of the history of the house and the way the house is designed, and like the layout of the house is like super weird, and it's like a maze, and it's kind of, that's also kind of weird. So it's like just like these little puzzle pieces which like are just, they aren't scary, but they make you a little bit uncomfortable, you know? They make you a little bit wary of like what's going on and how everything is connected to this house. It's getting good. So yeah, I'm probably gonna be finishing this tonight or tomorrow. Hello and welcome back. I am here to tell you my final thoughts on The Haunting of Hill House. Okay, I really liked this book, and I think the biggest thing I really liked about this book is that I feel like I could easily write an essay about this book if I were still in school. I liked that this book got me thinking a little bit more deeply. It had me asking questions that had me analyzing characters and their behaviors and themes in the book. I liked that. I'm a little bit of a nerd. I have fun analyzing things. So a few things that I thought were interesting, some themes that I noticed and was kind of diving into a little bit, is I think family is a big thing in this book. She comes from a family where she felt like she was kind of neglected her whole life, where she had to take care of everybody else, but nobody ever really took care of her or cared about her in any way. And then the other characters in this book, we come to find out that they all have similar feelings toward their own families. And so I feel like there's a lot in this book about all of these characters who are seeking family, who are seeking to feel cared for and seeking belonging and stuff. So I feel like there's a lot of that in this book, which I wasn't expecting to find in a horror book, but it was really interesting to follow those threads and see what happened in the end of the book. In the very beginning of this book, we quickly discover that our focal character, Eleanor, is not a very reliable narrator. She quickly begins lying to these other people who are staying at Hill House with her about her living situation, about her home life, about these things. And so because of that, we're kind of clued into the fact that we can't entirely trust her, or like the way she sees the world, the way she is describing things that are happening. And so I think that also makes it really interesting. Then it kind of becomes a puzzle, a little bit of a game, like, okay, how much of these spooky things that are happening in this house are all in Eleanor's head? How much of it is just her making stuff up, and how much of it is real? There are some moments, there are some things where we hear other characters talking about experiences they've had with the house, things that they've felt, things that they've seen or heard. And so we know that there are spooky things happening in this house, but because we're seeing things through the eyes of Eleanor and she's not entirely trustworthy, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know if it's actually happening or not, which makes for kind of a fun game. And lastly, I think it's super interesting just because of that, kind of going along with that, and also going along with the family situation. I think it's interesting just how psychological this gets. I thought it was interesting. There's a moment in this book, I don't want to spoil too much, but like I said, there's this whole like family theme, and like these characters don't come from different situations, different backgrounds, yet they all feel kind of neglected and unloved. I think it's interesting to see how that affects Eleanor and how this little bit of belonging, this little bit of hope that she gets when she first arrives at Hill House kind of spirals and escalates to the point where she has these like really like unrealistic hopes and expectations for what's going to happen after this research trip at Hill House. And when she discovers that those hopes and expectations are unrealistic and aren't going to turn out the way that she has imagined in her head, you see her kind of hit this breaking point. She kind of snaps. And I think that's really interesting, very interesting. And then we're kind of questioning Eleanor, not in like, oh, is she a reliable narrator? It becomes more of like, we're just questioning her entirely, and it gets really I loved that. And yeah, so I really enjoyed this one. Now finish out this vlog and do a little recap of everything. Do I like horror now? Or was Mexican Gothic a one-hit wonder for me when it comes to horror? Great question. I think I do like horror. I think I found that like in reading these 3 books, I still really love Mexican Gothic, and there's something about that. I don't know, I thought it might be easier for me after reading all 3 books. After reading all 3 of them, I thought it might be easier for me to kind of explain why that I liked that one so much. But I don't know, because like there are similarities between all of these books, and yet none of these books were quite the same as Mexican Gothic for me. None of them spooked me quite as thoroughly, but I did really enjoy these books, like we just mentioned. So for some superlatives for this video, for these 3 books, I would say the scariest, the one that had me making the most faces, would be The Hollow Places by T. Kingfisher. The descriptions of things in that book made me very uncomfy. There's some gory things that are described in that book that I couldn't help but not make faces about because it was gross. So if you like that kind of horror, definitely check out The Hollow Places. I would also say if you're new to horror and you want to be spooked, you want to be scared, but you're new to horror, I would recommend this book if you like fantasy or if you like sci-fi, because the scary things are largely taking part in a different world, in a different dimension. So if you like that kind of separation of world, and like, I would definitely recommend that for fans of sci-fi or fantasy. As far as the book that got me thinking the most, that ignited that nerd in me, I would definitely say The Haunting of Hill House. This one, like I said, I could easily write an essay about this if I had to. It got me thinking a lot, and a lot more deeply about things than I expected to, because I was just hoping to be scared in this vlog. So that was a very pleasant surprise. Yeah, if you like psychological kind of books, if you like psychological thrillers, mysteries, horror, this is my recommendation for you. The book that I read that is the most similar to Mexican Gothic, which is still my love when it comes to horror, is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. If you like haunted house stories where you're kind of dive into the history of like why the house is haunted, who or what is haunting the house, if you like that kind of haunted house story, I would say you'll like this one. Again, if you're new to horror, if you've ever read Rebecca and you liked it, I think you would like this book. It's very similar premise, so I definitely recommend this book if you like that. If you're a romance reader and you're new to horror, I would say this could be a good place to start. There's kind of a focus on like relationships in this book, so I think you might like it for that reason. Those are all of the books that I read in this vlog. Do I like horror? Yes, I do. I'd love to know if you like horror. What are some other books, horror or not, that you would recommend to me and anybody else who's watching to read for Halloween? Comment down below. And with all that said, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for listening to me ramble about books, and I will talk to you in my next video. Bye.